Good morning, or afternoon, I guess it's morning. Thank you, Jack. Thank you for all being here. Hope you can see Lisa's slides now. It was a little darker here. Want to do multiple introductions and announcements before. Number one, if you see a person with a red shirt, they're considered a volunteer, and we could use more volunteers. Love to have you. You might have a red shirt on, you're not really a volunteer. I think Joe Nicklick has a red shirt, but he's not a volunteer. So don't give him credit yet. We had a big event on 9/22/2022. We had 4 World War II planes here. We had a B-29, B-24, a Stearman, just like Dr. Bazal's plane there, and then a Ike Eisenhower's plane. We had 800 people. It was a very successful event. Lots of kids got to see things. Lots of people got educated. Just want to make you aware we have Bob Cleveland and some other people, Mr. Charles Keister doing simulators, so you can come and learn how to do a simulator in the other room during this time or later time. Bring a grandchild, bring a nephew or niece or anybody. We will have this Stearman flying overhead soon. It's been annualized, and so when you see it flying overhead, so you can just think of what happened during World War II. These are basic trainers used during World War II. At 1 o'clock, you're more than welcome to stay. We have a person named Ted Pritchett that's going to be honored. He's a Boise High School 1962 graduate, and he gave us 2 cabinets back there in memory of his Vietnam experiences. Remember, the Roses gave us cabinets too, but it's very nice of him to do that. He's going to have a little dedication ceremony. Diane Shaw is here, and she's going to announce a little bit about the honor flight. If Diane can come up here. I don't see her, and if she's not here, then I'll announce it.
She's already said something.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Just so you know, an honor flight was created in 2005. There's now 250,000 people that have gone on the honor flight. Very innovative. Started in 2004, 2005. Act of Congress has put it in law. But back in 1938, we also had an honor flight, but it was an honor train. I think about 474 Confederates, and I think 1,300 Northerners went to Gettysburg on a train and spent a whole week there, and it was on the government check. So that was done at that time. The average age was 94 years of age. So they're recreating a similar event that happened by train at that time. We have a couple other talks coming in the future. David Steele is going to talk about 9/11. He was at the Pentagon when it happened. He's got a little bit of, a lot of thoughts about it, so I think you'll enjoy him 2 weeks from now. Bruce Willis is a writer coming from Jasper to talk a couple weeks after that. If you look in our foyer there, it has a quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he says the world must never forget what happened here. And one of our people who was taking a tour told me when he said that when he was at one of the prison camps in World War II. And he said, we have to talk about this because people will deny something like this atrocious thing that happened. But that's our quote in our front foyer, and it's said by Dwight D., and I didn't know it was the time when he was visiting one of the prison camps. We've got an educator getting ready to talk, and I just want to introduce her. Her husband I've known longer than her. He was split in for Memorial when they beat Rice 33-0. 33-0 in 1965, and Herman Byers made them run up and down the stairs for about 2 years after that. Mr. Muller was crossing on the sidelines, and he was in front of Mr. Paget. Mr. Paget became the coach after that. And they called it guard eligible play, and Mr. Paget spotted it, and he yelled to the team, guard eligible, but they couldn't hear him. So Mr. Muller was walking by or running by, and Mr. Paget said, good call, coach. Now, if anybody knows Mr. Paget, I think his blood pressure probably went to 200 over 100, because Bob Paget didn't like anybody saying that, and he would have shaken and beat Mr. Muller into the pulpit if he had a chance. And Mr. Muller ran off, free as a little bird. Anyway, he was this football star. We're not talking about football today. We're talking about something else. We're talking about education. And she's one of the best examples of education. Just retired from the Castle School System 40 or 41 years, but taught English, taught special writing, and I think we could do without math. Don't tell my accountants that we said that, but math is not needed. I think that your ability to speak comes if you can write. And she's taught these young kids to write. And talk about write a little bit about the subject we're going to talk about today. And if you look at theories of education, much education in your life comes from your relatives, your family. Even though she's a teacher, teachers are important, but your own family is a real important part of teaching. You don't think your kids or your grandkids are listening, but they actually listen sometimes. They don't show it in body language, but they are listening. So you're the teachers, not just Lisa. You're the teachers, and if you don't bring your kids out here, your grandkids, your nieces and nephews, you are not passing on an important piece of information that needs to pass on to the next generation. So I'm not going to tell you again, but come on out here. We're open a lot of days. I'd love to have you. Tremendous amount of docents, tremendous amount of education here. And before I introduce Lisa, we have Mr. Pritchett's brother, who comes to a lot of these things. He went to Harrison instead of Boise, but he's been here at most of these talks. He's sitting next to Mr. Joe Nicolette, but he doesn't have a red shirt on. Okay, now Lisa has done tremendous about, in this topic, she was inspired, I think about 1996. That inspiration was something that when you hear her, you will really be amazed. So I can't say more about her and her educational experience. So Lisa Muller.
Good morning. Can everybody hear? Yes? Louder? Okay. I can talk loud. I was talking freshman for the last 38 years, and I sometimes had to talk at a pretty good pace. Well, I'm here this morning to talk about a person who lived through World War II in a different way than much of what we're looking at here. She spent World War II either hiding in a basement or in a ghetto or in a transit camp, 4 labor camps, a death march. I mean, her experience really encapsulates much of what happened to the civilian population. And the title might seem a little odd, A Life Well Lived, after what I've told you, how she spent those 5 years. But she was such an amazing human being, an amazing, inspiring human being, and her legacy lives on. And I think you'll agree by the end of the talk that she truly was. She truly had a life well lived. So, my story with Gerda Klein starts in November of 1996. I was at an English teachers meeting in Chicago, thousands of English teachers there, and I would go through the book and pick out the sessions that I wanted to go to. And I saw one, a Holocaust survivor was going to speak. I never heard of her. I wasn't a student of the Holocaust at all. I was interested, but I was not, I didn't have my passion for it until that day. I went to the room where she was going to speak, and the person at the door said, "Oh no, the fire marshal says we're way overloaded and I'm sorry you can't come." And I must have looked really pitiful because she said, "Okay, you can go in if you sit on the floor." And I ended up sitting on the floor in front of her. She was here, and this is my husband, Bill, the football star. But I was right about where he is, sitting on the floor, looking up at Gerda Klein speak. And I was amazed. I felt it was as if the whole room just faded away, and she was talking, and I was listening. And I heard the story, and I heard all that had happened to her. And by the end, I was so taken with what kind of human being I could tell that she was. She was full of kindness, of gratitude, of love for her fellow human beings. And I said, how did this happen? How, after all that she's gone through, is she such an amazing person? So full of kindness and love and gratitude and no bitterness. How did it happen? So, as I say, I was at a conference for English teachers, and there's a giant exhibit hall full of books. An English teacher's dream. And, oops, I knew this was going to happen. Did you go up there? Right, there we go. I raced down to the exhibit hall to find a copy of her book. I just wanted that answer. How did it happen that she came through all this as such an amazing human being? I stayed up most of the night reading the book. And I've had other people that I've loaned it to that have done the same thing. But when I was finished, I had an idea of what an amazing, how this happened. And the core of her that made it possible for her to come through this. And the next thing I said, I want my students to read it. So I came back to Newburgh and found a way to get 40 copies of the book. And I carefully doled them out. We had to read them in class because I had 160 kids in 5 classes. And we read those books, and we talked about it. We learned about what had happened. I put it in context of the whole Nazi takeover of Germany and of Poland. And then we looked at her and how she came through this and how her story could help us become more resilient, caring, positive, grateful human beings instead of just complaining about this, that, or the other little thing. So she's been an inspiration for many, many, many kids. She's also, her humility, she was a very humble woman and I think she knew how many people she was touching, but she was never a big shot. Never, always humble, always filled with gratitude, as I've said, compassion and love for her fellow human beings. She was sad, but she was never bitter. This book was written in 1957 when most Holocaust survivors were still not talking about their experiences. It's been in print for 65 years, which is unheard of in the publishing industry. Books come in and out of print, but this book has been in print for 65 years. Knowing Gerda and reading her book with students every year for over 25 years changed the arc of my career and the arc of my life. I became passionate about teaching the lessons of the Holocaust. Then I became a teaching fellow with the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And I remember, where's Wayne Trockman? Do you remember the day we went through the museum? Yeah, that was a great day. It was a great day. But yes, I became a museum fellow, and I've gotten to study in New York and even in Jerusalem. Also at the National Catholic Center for Holocaust Education for educators who are also Catholic. And it's just been, I'm as gratitude-filled as Gerda about the things that this book has done for me and the places it has taken me. First, we have to look at Nazi ideology. And I'm not going to go into a lot because I'm not an expert, but I know enough to, I hope, put it in context for my students. Nazi ideology centered on two ideas, race and space. There was that white supremacy, the word used was Aryan, which is really not an accurate description of people at all, but it was resurrected it was an ancient term. It was resurrected in the middle of the 19th century to denote white supremacy. And Hitler really loved that idea of white supremacy, white superiority, and he constantly used the word Aryan. And sadly, there are groups today that still use that word, and it does not mean good things. The other part of it was space, Lebensraum, which that's probably, if you could speak German, that I'm sorry I butchered that. Living room. He wanted to move into Europe to provide living space for the people who he thought deserved it. Let's see if I can make it. Can you make that go? I just not figured this out yet. There it is. Now I need the bathroom. This map is I just wanted a graphic that showed how much space was dominated by the Nazis between 1933 and 1945. And it's in the red, and that's all I need to do there. So that's the space part. And then the other thing that was done, there was the creation of the demigod, and this was Hitler. He first became chancellor in 1933, and legally, I mean, his party was voted in. Then he was appointed, and immediately, he started his terrible march towards dictatorship. There was the Enabling Act. There was all kinds of anti-Jewish legislation. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. The first concentration camp was established in March of 1933. Did you realize it was that soon? March of 1933, 2 months after he became chancellor. It was mainly for political prisoners, rather than he hadn't had the full idea of what he would do to the Jewish people. But yes, it was March of 1933. April 1st, 1933, he organized a boycott of Jewish businesses. I mean, he'd only been chancellor for a couple of months, and he takes that action. I think I have a picture of that. I don't know. I can't make this slide thing work very well. I'm used to my little clicker at school. Help is on the way. On the left. Okay. So this is a picture of prisoners at Dachau. They were rounded up. They were mostly political prisoners, people who just disagreed with Hitler in one way or another. They were humiliated. They were beaten. And then most of them were sent back home with strict orders. Do not talk about this, or else your whole family will be back. That was the terror of the Nazis. If a person objected, or if a person tried to resist, maybe the whole family would be wiped out, or the whole block. And there were cases later in the war where it was a whole town. So that makes it much harder to say, I'm going to be brave and speak up and do what I need to do. Well, what if 500 people have to pay for your standing up? That makes it a whole different deal. People were in impossible situations. Okay, So Dachau, and then the boycott of Jewish businesses. And this slide explains that. People were ordered to not shop or trade with Jewish stores, Jewish businesses. And for the most part, it was a failure. However, it started that whole idea of, well, those people are dangerous, those people are less than, those people are, and there was a lot of, I always tell my students, if you hear somebody say, those people, watch out. Be careful of what they're saying about those people. That's how it starts. ADL has Vienna Defamation League has a wonderful resource. It's a triangle where things start out with singling people out, making them sound dangerous. And then the triangle goes up and actions are taken and then laws are changed. And then, it goes on up to genocide. Now, I'm not saying that every act of bias will cause a genocide, but no genocide started without the bias at the beginning. So be careful. Be careful of what you listen to. Be careful of what you hear. Evaluate. Think it through. I'm talking to you like I talk to my students. Is that okay? I love my students. Loved them all. Loved them all. So the next thing, and this is really, okay, next slide. Oh, I hit one on the right again. I'm a little dyslexic too. There we go, got it, I got it. I finally figured out which is left. This is a slide of the Nazi-sponsored book burning. And this took place in May of 1933, so we're still very early in the war. And all things un-German were burned. The Iliad, the Odyssey, Shakespeare, Jack London. I mean, millions of books were burned. This is the library at the University of Berlin. And that hurts me, as an English teacher. That really... We need to read, we need to have access to all kinds of material, and it was just being taken away, one thing after another. Jewish people suffered even more than the general population. Students were banned from schools, Jewish businesses and shops were stolen from their owners and given to a non-Jewish person. Whether it was a tailor shop or a haberdashery or whatever, it was taken away from the Jewish business owners and Aryanized. Jewish homes were stolen, and you'll hear more about that in just a minute. And things just got worse and worse and worse. In 1933, I already said that. There was a decree for the protection of the German people, which eliminated freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and then the Reichstag fire happened in 1933. There is still no conclusive evidence on who started it, but it was used as an excuse to basically declare martial law. The right to assemble, the right to free speech, freedom of the press. It removed all restraints on police investigations. People could be arrested because somebody didn't like the way they looked, or somebody didn't like that their dog was barking all night. But it was just all local governments could be overruled or overthrown. And got my little notes here. So the next thing was, you already saw a slide, a scary slide of Hitler that said one people, one country, one leader. He wanted to eliminate all differences, and also he demanded that people pledge allegiance to him, not to a flag, not to a country, to him personally. And that is dangerous stuff. Okay, so now we're getting into Gerda's part of the story. She lived in Poland, right at the 20 miles from the Czech border. And so she knew that they were, well, she didn't really know. She was 14, she was 15. And she did not realize the danger that was coming. Nazism in Poland. Okay, Poland was invaded on September 1st, 1939, and they surrendered on September 28th, 1939. First of all, there had been a non-aggression agreement between Poland and Germany, and so they weren't as afraid as they should have been, and by the time they were, it was too late. This was where the term blitzkrieg came in. It was a massive assault of tanks and planes and soldiers against the small Polish army, some of whom were still on, some of the soldiers were still on horseback. So immediately there was murder of government officials, of teachers, of religious leaders, priests and ministers, anyone who might resist. All Polish people were considered racially inferior. Immediately after the invasion, the Nazis began a reign of terror with the intention of destroying the Polish nation and culture. In fact, until 1942, most of the people that were in the well-established camp system in Germany and Poland were non-Jewish people. But then that all changed after the final solution, which was the elimination of the Jewish people. It's estimated that between 1.8 and 1.9 million non-Jewish Poles were murdered by the Nazis, in addition to the at least 3 million Jewish citizens of Poland, and another 20,000 children were taken from their families and sent to Germany in hopes that they would become Germanized or become German citizens. There was one of the worst things that I've read about is the Warsaw Ghetto. The ghettoization of the Jewish people was a way to separate them from their former friends and neighbors. And so people wouldn't ask, well, where did they go? What happened to them? So ghettoization was a step in the process. The Warsaw Ghetto was established in 1940. I think it was opened in 1941. People were starving. People were cold. There was no way to, there wasn't enough food, a caloric allowance that did not allow people to live. This is what I knew would happen. The notes are here and there. But there were, I think it is 400,000 people in a space that was very small, like less than 1.5 miles square. And the average was 7 to 9 people per room, per small room. Not enough food, not enough anything. There was a lot of resistance in the ghetto. Much of it had to be quiet. There was a widespread smuggling operation. There were secret libraries. There were secret get-togethers where people would hear talks, would learn. They tried to do their best with continuing the learning process with the children, who were very vulnerable in there. And then there was the milk cans. There was a professor of history, Emanuel Ringelbaum, and his idea was to document what happened. We need to tell the world. The documentation was hidden in milk cans and buried in the ghetto. And some of those milk cans have been found, but not all of them. And I don't know, the time may be up on those, but several of them were found after the war, and it is an invaluable resource about the things that happened to people in that ghetto. There's a slide of, and I just have the map there as a background. And what I want to ask you now, how many camps do you think there were in Germany? or in Europe? Anybody? Anybody? Hundreds? What? Huh? 20? This is going to be a shocker. And this is well documented by the historians at the Holocaust Museum. They have been working on this for years. And they're not all huge camps. These were places of incarceration. It might be that a factory owner wanted to buy, because they actually did buy prisoners, I'll buy 25 girls to run my weaving factory. And they were put, they were kept in a garage, maybe a building like this, maybe 1/8 this size, and that would be counted too. So, yes, but that is a shocking number. That also includes the ghettos. And is anybody else surprised? I remember a few years ago when the number reached 10,000, and I was absolutely shocked. But the new numbers, the most recent numbers, and the well-researched and well-documented number is 44,000, which is even more shocking. And now, okay, we're going to talk about Gerda's journey. We're getting to what happened here. I'm going to step off this bathroom. So we talked about the I wish I could see that. Oh, thank you, genius. So we talked about the invasion of Poland, and immediately Gerda and her, as I say, she was 15 years old. And she was banned from school, from parks, from libraries, and even from her very own garden. She couldn't even go out in her garden. She went out one day, and it was spring, and things were just beginning to bloom, and she sees the sign, "For Germans only," on her own garden. I'll explain why she was there. By October of 1939, her brother had been conscripted into hard labor. He was sent into interior Poland and then Russia. They had letters from him for a while, but she never saw him again. Her father's business was Aryanized, stolen from him right away. They just took it over. They said, you're not the owner of this business anymore. Too bad. No recourse. Her home, 2 days before Christmas, was Aryanized. It was the Nazi soldier came in and said, you all pack up what you can. You're moving into the basement, and a non-Jewish family gets to live in your house. So from December of 1939 to April of 1942, she lived in her cold, moldy basement, which flooded when it rained and had no electricity. But they were so grateful to still be home. And that spring of 1940 or 41 was when she went out to the garden and found that sign. Sorry, you cannot step into your garden ever again. In April of 1942, all the Jewish people were taken to the Bielsko ghetto, and it was not as bad as Warsaw, but it was terrible. There were 2 families, 7 people in a 2-room apartment, 7 adult-sized people. And then in June of 1942, she was transported to a transit camp, and then the first of 4 labor camps. And she saw her parents for the last time. In that march from the ghetto to the trucks that would take them away, they could have marched directly there. It was a small town. But those Nazi soldiers, with the urge for cruelty, marched those girls and women. The men had already been sent to another work camp. Marched those girls through that town so that they could see everything and everyone could see them being taken away. Gerda was shocked to see there was a movie at the movie theater. There was a sale at the butcher shop. People were living their lives. And here these people had been locked into this ghetto all those years. Now, I don't know. She got over the shock of seeing that life was going on. Her mother was loaded onto one truck. She was loaded onto another. Those worthy of work, those who could work were sent one direction. Her mother and other people were sent the other way. And as I say, that's the last time she saw her parents. She went to 4 labor camps, the first of which was really, in the scheme of all things, a blessing. It was called Vulcaning, and it was a weaving factory. And she was there, I have the dates. Well, she was there from July of first the transit camp. She was there from July of 1942 to August of 43. So she was there a little over a year. First, though, the transit camp. The transit camp was like an exchange. It was like a marketplace. These girls are marched in there and lined up, and a factory owner would come and he would say, I'll take that one, and that one, and that one, and that one, and that one. And he paid about $1 a piece for those human lives. $1 a piece. And then she was the property of that factory owner. As I say, she was there a little over a year, and they were threatened, and constantly threatened, but she was never beaten. And there was a Nazi guard there named Frau Kugler. And Frau Kugler, when Gerda first describes her, she said she had the face and the jaws of a bulldog. And I knew it was going to be terrible. Frau Kugler turned out to be one of the few Germans who treated these girls with humanity and with respect, and she did everything she could for them. She couldn't do things out in the open, but she could get them extra food. She could keep them safe. There was one time when Gerda was so sick and her fever was so high. She said, I can't go to work. I can't. Frau Kugler came to her bunk and said, Gerda, get up. And you have to work today. This is life and death. There was an inspector there, and all the girls who were sick were sent directly to Auschwitz. Frau Kugler made sure that Gerda got to her weaving machine and propped her up on it. And she started to fall, and Frau Kugler said, no, Gerda, life and death. Frau Kugler saved her life that day. And she did that for the girls. She allowed them to get together in the evenings to have a little fun if no one was around. If another Nazi came in, another guard came in, she had to be, with the bulldog face. And it was, when I think of her, Frau Kugler, and what she did, she showed what could be done quietly and yet meaningfully. And another thing Gerda says, and she said long after the war, she said, Frau Kugler pinned a lie to the lips of all those who said there was nothing they could do. They may not have been able to get up and throw things and make a speech, but there were things that people could do. And the whole time that Gerda was in the system, she found very few that were willing to do those kinds of things. In September of 1942, it was the day of Yom Kippur, and the factory owner threatened the girls. Said, don't you dare slack off. Don't you dare think that because of what your religion says, you get a day off or a day of rest or a day to be quiet and think. But the girls quietly kept the fast that whole day. And she said, they quietly fasted while working hard to produce the prescribed amount of work. And she said at the end, about that day, there was a proud serenity about every one of us, a sense of accomplishment. And that's a big part of what's in Gerda Klein's book, is the spiritual resistance. Even if they couldn't do something physically, they kept a part of themselves. They honored their spiritual practices. They were wonderful to one another. Another reason that Gerda survived, she always would say, I didn't survive because I was smarter or more brave or because of anything I did. I was either lucky, and she was, to stay in her home for a year. She was lucky to get this camp. She was lucky Brad Kugler was there. Or someone else helped me. That's the only way. And there it is. We have to take care of one another and pay attention to one another. In the next camp Gerda went to was horrible. In August of 43, she went to Marsdorf, and the work was horrible. It was stacking flax, and they cut their arms. It was hot. They didn't get water while they were working, and they worked 12-hour shifts. A supervisor came to her and said, well, little girl, would you like a little extra food? And she knew this was a landmine. If she said yes, that might mean, well, I'm criticizing the camp for not giving me enough food. She figured out very soon, he was teasing her, and he wanted to trade food for sexual favors. She was, she's still a young kid, and she was just horrified by this. She just stayed silent. He walked away, but then he hesitated, and he came back, and he said, you'll be sorry for this. And she found out very soon how sorry she would be. She worked her 12 hours with the flax. She fell into her bunk. A supervisor came in, called out names, said, you all, and Gerda was one of them, have to work another 12-hour shift unloading coal. And so she worked 24 hours straight. And then she fell into her bunk again, time to go to work at the flax. So she kept going. For 5 days, she worked 24 hours at a time. This was the time when she almost gave up. She said, I can't do this. I cannot do this. And then she remembered what she promised her father before they left home. He said to her, Gerda, I know this is hard, and we may not survive it, but please don't ever take your own life. And she said, I promise, Papa. And she considered that a sacred vow. And that night, when she was looking at those train tracks and unloading that coal, she remembered that promise. And she held on. And in a few days, then the supervisor from the weaving plant came back and said, I need her back. And so she was transferred to another camp that was livable. So she ended up in four labor camps. And both the details of what happened and even more her reactions to what she had to face every day is what makes this what it is. So, let me see. Oh, okay, I'm still good on this. So the four camps, then the last camp, the Russians were approached, this was late 1944. The Russians were approaching from the east. The Allies were approaching from the west. Germany knew it was over. So they started trying to get rid of the girls and get rid of the prisoners. 2,000 girls were lined up in rows of 5. Some of them had shoes, some of them didn't. It's January in northern Poland. And they start the marching. 2,000 girls. She had on ski boots because her father, the day they left for the ghetto, said, Gerda, wear your ski boots today. And she said, Papa, ski boots in June? Just wear them. And she said, people didn't question their Papa, so she put her ski boots on, and they saved her life. So again, it was just one of those little things that we don't even notice that sometimes make all the difference. So, yes, the Death March. They traveled about 350 miles in the cold, frozen snow, and by the time they got to a bicycle factory in the Czechoslovakia, there were 120 girls left, 120 from 2000. And they left the girls all along the way. So then the liberation. Okay, so anyway, the liberation. One day, as she was standing in the doorway of the bicycle factory in Czechoslovakia, she saw a Jeep coming down the hill with a big white star on it. And she recognized that it was the American soldiers coming. And the Jeep comes down the hill. I'm going to let her tell you in just a minute, but I just have to tell you, listening to the story that day in Chicago, and she said they looked like people from another world. They looked like gods. And she weighed, at the time, 68 pounds. Her hair had turned white. She was 20, almost 21. Her hair had turned white, 68 pounds, and she hadn't had a bath for several years. And she couldn't believe these people that were dead and were taken care of walked in. And one of the soldiers said to her, what's happening? He said, would you show me the other ladies? And Gerda hadn't been called a lady for 6 years. She'd been called called horrible names, but never a lady. She said, and then this soldier opened the door for me. And she said, I didn't understand it. He was being polite. And then that day in Chicago, she sweeps her hand over to the corner, at the side of the room, and said, and he's been opening doors for me ever since. Yeah. So, this book has everything. I have a little bit of film where Gerda, you get to hear her words, and yeah. And I put the closed caption on.
View of freedom and liberation came that morning when I stood in this doorway of the abandoned factory. And I saw a car coming down the hill. And the reality of that came when I saw the white star on its hood and not the swastika. And there were two men in that car. One jumped out.
I saw some skeletal figures trying to get some water from a hand pump, but over on the other side, leaning next to against the wall, next to the entrance of the building, I saw a girl standing, and I decided to walk up to her.
I remember that aura of that awe, of the disbelief in daylight, to really see someone who fought for our freedom, for my ideals. And he looked like God to me.
And I asked her in German and in English whether she spoke either language. She answered me in German.
And I knew what I had to say. And I said to him, we are Jewish, For a very long time. At least to me it seemed very long. He didn't answer me. And then his own voice betrayed his emotion. He was wearing dark glasses, I couldn't see his eyes. He said, so am I.
I asked about her companions.
He said, may I see the other ladies? A form of address we hadn't heard for 6 years. most of the girls were inside, they were too ill to walk. And he said to me, "Won't you come with me?" I didn't know what he meant. So he held the door open for me and let me proceed. And that was the moment of restoration of humanity, of humaneness, of dignity, of freedom.
We went inside the factory. It was an indescribable scene. There were women scattered over the floor on scraps of straw. Some of them quite obviously with a mark of death on their faces.
I took him to see my friends.
The girl who was my guide made sort of a sweeping gesture over this scene of devastation and said the following words: "Noble be man, merciful and good." And I could hardly believe that she was able to summon a poem by the German poet Goethe, which is called The Divine, at such a moment. And there was nothing that she could have said that would have underscored the grim irony of the situation better than what she did.
And his first young American Liberation Day is now my husband. He opened not only the door for me, but the door to my life and my future.
That's from the short
I'm
film.
very clear.
That was from the short film, 1995. She made a short documentary that won the Oscar for short documentaries. As I said, she wrote the memoir in 1957, the Oscar film in 1995, and she continues her journey to tell the story, to instill the ideas of kindness, gratitude, responsibility, and resilience. In fact, she wrote an editorial in the spring of 2020 when I was at home teaching online and all my students were in their homes. And she wrote an editorial in the Arizona Republic, because she lived in Phoenix at that time, about how to get through this time. Not once did she say, "If I could do it, you could do it." She never ever said anything like that. She said, "We can do this. We can deal with this isolation and missing your friends and missing school." She took her time and wrote that most beautiful editorial, and her writing is beautiful. She journeys to tell the story, and instill those ideas. She came to Castle High School in November of 2000, one of the best days of my life. And she spoke to a full auditorium. We had no idea how many people were going to come. Every seat was full. It was inspiring. One thing I remember, we had hired an off-duty policeman as a security guy, because that's the way the world is. And as we walked out, we've known this man for a long time. As we walked out, he was crying. And he said, "Now I understand why my dad, who had liberated those camps as an American soldier, I now understand his deep pain and why he could never talk about this." She focuses on issues, always in her talking and her writing, she focused on issues such as discrimination, hunger, teen mental health, and suicide prevention. When Columbine happened, she went right there. She went right there to help those kids. Can I have 3 more minutes? I've got one more thing, and that's, sorry. One thing I want to say. I urge you. She told me that day in Chicago, she told a whole room full of people. She says, "You are the bridge to a time I shall not see. And you must tell this story tell your students, tell your colleagues, and tell other people. And now, once you know the story, you're part of that bridge. This book will change your life. It will change your children's lives. It will change your grandchildren's lives. I'm not selling books, I promise, but this is amazing. You'll never be the same. And you are now a witness to the witness to the witness. And one more thing, this is Gerda passed away this last spring. 2 weeks before she would have turned 98, and we had just read her book in class. And so it was hard to tell the kids. And because I always said, yes, she's still living and she's still working and she's still going places. But she left us with such a legacy that we'll be okay. Can you play that? It's about 3 minutes.
This week we highlight another life well lived. In an address on Tuesday to the United Nations Security Council, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky detailed atrocities. This week we highlight another life well lived. In an address on Tuesday to the United Nations Security Council, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky detailed atrocities he called the most terrible since World War II in a Russian invasion that has conjured memories of one of the darkest chapters in human history.
Gerda Weissman Klein stood as living testament to that time and spent her life keeping it alive in our collective memory. Gerda was a 15-year-old Jewish girl living in Poland when the Nazis invaded in 1939. 3 years later, she was separated from her parents and brother and sent to a forced labor camp. She never saw them again. In 1945, Gerda was marched by German troops with thousands of other prisoners, some 350 miles across Europe. She was among the 200 who somehow survived and reached Czechoslovakia. On May 7th of that year, the door to the barn where Gerda was held captive opened, and she saw the faces of American troops there to liberate her. Among them, a German refugee turned U.S. intelligence officer named Kurt Klein. After meeting under those circumstances, Kurt and Gerda were engaged that September and married the next year in Paris. They later moved together to the United States. Gerda's 1957 autobiography, All But My Life, remains essential reading in Holocaust education.
I was the only one from my family who survived.
And was the subject of a 1995 documentary that won both an Emmy and an Oscar. In 2011, President Obama presented Gerda with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She said that day, "If darkness seems so total, if you think there is no way out, remember, never ever give up." Gerda Weissman Klein, a Holocaust survivor who spent her life inspiring hope and courage in others, died last Sunday at home in Phoenix. She was 97 years old.
2 weeks short of being 98.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Find your favorite recipes, celebrity interviews, uplifting stories, shop.
Wish I was a little smoother with the...
This is the most important part of the, as important as anything. You might get some microphones out to some other people. This is called, it's called Lunch, Learn. So you've done the lunch, you've done the learn, now you do the share. The share is most important because we can ask stories of Lisa and you can ask questions. Forrest will transport a microphone out. We've got two other people on my team and we'll get a microphone out to some other people. I'll ask the first question. First question is when they got to the, back in May of, I guess, 45, when they were started getting ready to be freed, I think there was a time bomb in there that they were going to explode and didn't work, or you never heard this story. There were 120 girls that had taken the walk and they were going to be destroyed at that time to get rid of all the stories that you've heard of the atrocities. Is that correct?
That is correct. And no one really knows. Can you turn that off? That light on the projector. So no one really knows why that bomb did not go off that day. It was raining, and perhaps that was it. But that was one of those times when, as Gerda said, it was always either good luck or good help from someone helped me, like Frau Kugler, like Kurt, and many other times.
The second question before we open up to everybody else, if you hear of a death march, you think of the Bataan Death March. The Bataan Death March happened over in the Philippines, I think around 1942 or 43, and at that time, 62,000 Filipinos, 12,000 Americans, and the death rate at that point was 5%. 5%. What you just heard was a death rate of 95% of this 2,000 young women, a death rate of 95%, but they did go for 350 miles. They went for 3 months in the cold. The Bataan March was at 112 degrees, just a little bit different. But when you hear the Death March, you don't hear about this Death March. Just as significant as the Bataan Death March in another way. Comments, please?
Well, one thing I forgot to say, the night that Gerda, I can't believe it, when Gerda came to Castle High School and she stood on that stage, she said she didn't know that there were 2 soldiers from Kurt's battalion that were there that night with their wives. And she said, I would have been to Newburgh sooner if I would have known these men were so close. And she said to them, thank you. You saved my life. I would not be here tonight if it weren't for you. We also had George Weigel in the audience, who was a liberator of the Bergen-Belsen camp. Some of you might have known him. And my father-in-law, who was a prisoner of war in a German camp for over a year. And those guys, they dropped, and sometimes it was somebody's mom. They dropped everything and they saved the world. And we all owe them a debt of gratitude. One other thing, when I was in the Czech Republic one summer, we were in a small town. We walked to the main square. The name of the main street was the Avenue of the American Soldiers. And that was 60 years later.
We should talk about Bill's dad. We have him on YouTube, and all these will be on YouTube. You have to go to browninggenealogy.org and go to YouTube. You hear every one of these things. So if you have friends that want to hear Lisa, it'll be up there in about 4 days. But Bill's dad was a prisoner of war out of a B-24 that went down. 2 of them survived, and he was a prisoner of war for a year. He only died at 101 not too long ago. But we're not just all angels here. You have the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee Indians. You think of the attrition rate of the Cherokee Indians going from what Andrew Jackson pushed them out to Oklahoma, and it was just about as bad as this. I don't have the statistics on that. And during our lifetime, you look at the Tibetan civilization in China, some of the same atrocities are happening at this time, and you probably have another 100 examples of that. But we have to, as human beings, give some human rights and try to stand behind human rights. Things happen all the time that shouldn't happen. Other questions for this side here, or is anybody? Announce your name, say your name and what the question is.
I'm Rhonda. I was wondering if there were any liberators in the Alsace-Lorraine area, or were there any camps in the Alsace-Lorraine area?
I'm just not sure of that, and I don't want to give you an answer that would be inaccurate. I do want to say another thing. Is that okay? I am involved with a group called Evansville.org, and we are going to have and I had it on the slide, but it's off now. We are, oh, there we go. We are presenting a workshop open to all interested parties, all of you, bringing mind, heart, and conscience to reflective conversations on topics that matter. We cannot ignore unpleasantness in history. We cannot say to our children, we don't want to upset you about anything. Some of the things we've done are upsetting. And how do we learn? We don't learn by closing books and taking books off the shelf. We learn by taking it out, looking at it, and learning from it. That's the only way that we can live up to our potential as decent human beings. So, you're all welcome. It's online. All you have to do is register. And, if you know teachers or people who are in the business of dealing with kids or teaching in any way, everyone's welcome. It's absolutely free, but you do need to register to get the Zoom sign up. And if you need to know anything else about Cyprus, and I have one of my Cyprus sisters here, right there, we do workshops and we do things it's called the Committee to Promote Respect in Schools and in Society. And we are in need of that.
Thank you. Forrest, you see anybody else that needs any other questions? Go ahead.
Norman Kohler. I was going to tell you the way the Nazis came to power. They were so restricted, Germany, after World War I, that their economy had just completely collapsed in Germany. A bag of flour was $50 or something, and their money was useless. They had completely collapsed. So Hitler comes along and says he's going to make Germany great again. And so people were so destitute that they just listened to him. And that's how really they came to power.
Yeah, that happens very often in civilizations. Any other questions over here? I might go ahead and introduce yourself.
Deborah Switzer. I wanted to say something that few people know, but Hitler's nephew was a member of the American military. He grew up in England, and then somehow he became, I think he was in the Navy, but I'm not sure, but I thought that was really surprising that he served on the opposite side.
Not familiar with that.
Any other questions, Mike? There's two other things I wanted to announce then. I can't thank Lisa enough and for the educational experience. I think Bill wrote the speech, but I won't tell anybody. Just kidding. But two other things I need to announce. We have Halloween here, and that's on 10/30/2022. We had it last year, very educational. There's about 10 questions in front of each exhibit, so if you have grandkids or nieces or nephews that want to come out, we're open that day. The times on that mic are 10 to 4 or 12 to 4, but it's Halloween on the 30th. I know 31st is really Halloween, but it's a Sunday. What hours are there for us, do you know? 12 to 4. So it's actually learning. We have some candy, but they learn something about this, a visual experience, plus there's a few questions in each exhibit. We have probably more skeletons than most places in the world. So Donna Bone's got a lot of skeletons here. The second thing is Kathy Renner. Would you raise your hand back there? Kathy Renner was a fundraiser for University of Evansville for the last couple of decades, and she used to live on Lombard Avenue. I don't remember her maiden name, but what was her maiden name? Fowler. So for some of you know Fowler, but she's now the fundraiser or the development director for the P47 Foundation. That plane over there is still in debt a little bit, and that tank is too, so she's trying to get us out of debt. Even though interest rates are going up, we are still paying interest on those too. So if you have any time, she'd love to talk to you about things on the P47 Foundation. That's different than the Evansville Wartime Museum, so a little bit different organization. Now, a month from now, a guy named, he's on your list, there's a speaker, his name's Bruce Wilson. He will talk about one of the Doolittle Raiders that was in a Japanese prison camp for many years, and he saw the Lord, and it was his savior, and he had a quote, not exactly like Gerda's, it was actually spiritual for her after being abused and beat up for 6 years. She said, there was some nobleness in human beings. How could she even say that and have no bitterness after 6 years of atrocities? But she was a person beyond, and Bruce will talk about a person from beyond as well. So, anything else? Bill Willis, okay? His name's Bill Willis, not Bruce. So he's a writer, and he interviewed this guy for the Doolittle Run. So I think you'd enjoy that. That's a month from now. Okay, thank you for coming. Come on back, and if you want to stay at 1 o'clock, we've got a dedication of a bridge exhibit.